Okay, hey, welcome to our Talk Story event today, Sunday, April
Seventh.
the 7th. All right, okay, I'm not always with it, but being a retired person, days are all the same to me. I'm Stan Liu. I'm the Talk Story Director with the 1882 Foundation. I want to welcome you all here. And we hold our Talk Story events at least once a month, and we've been doing it since it originated in 2012. We're always here in DC Chinatown, and we've always been live, except during the pandemic. We started doing online, and so right now we're continuing on with hybrids presentations where we're trying to do it online as well as live here in DC Chinatown, because we want to keep connection with DC Chinatown, because Chinatown, the way I look at it, is sort of the birthplace of Asian America. And that's where our stories originated in this country and how a lot of people perceive us. So we're still trying to do them here live in DC. We are doing it live from our newly renovated 1882 offices. And this is the first presentation we've done live here at our newly renovated office. So you're welcome to come visit us at our office and participate. And if you have any ideas for events here, let us know and we'll try to fit you in, because we're part of the community here in DC. And so we are live streaming and recording. And I think we're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. So I welcome all you who are watching on those avenues. So, and if you're uncomfortable with being seen and heard, then turn off your camera and participate with us through the chat box and ask your questions that way. And all the audience will be muted during the program, but during the open discussion and a question and answer session afterwards, the audience members will be unmuted, and our associates will be overseeing the chat box, and if you have any questions, we'll make sure that your questions are addressed by our moderators and presenters. So with that, we invite you to go on into the chat box now and tell us where you're from and say hello and greet each other and see who's in our audience here. So welcome again. This gathering of our community is done because we here at 1882 are dedicated to promoting, uncovering, understanding, and sharing our American stories. So it's a gathering of our friends and allies, community, and co-conspirators, if you will, to share our stories of our lives, our heritage, history, hopes and ambitions, trials and tribulations. And because we found that the strength of our community lies in the power of the stories we share with each other. And we invite you to partner with us on a regular basis through your participation and support. You can always get information about us on our website, 1882foundation.org. And some of our partners in this experience have been other advocate groups such as OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, Chinese American Citizens Alliance, DC Chinatown Service Center, Chinese American Museum in DC, DC Public Library, Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage. And so they all share with us our passion for telling our stories, our American stories, in our own voices. And today we're real honored to hear another aspect of our stories, and moderating this session is going to be our education director for 1882, Ching Yi Yoi, and he's going to introduce our really great speakers that we have lined up for today. And you've seen the subject matter, what about our children? What about the children? And also it's going to be talking about our China roots, how to tap into our heritage. So with that, Tingy, I'll let you take over the program.
Thank you very much, Stan, and welcome to everybody who's both here in person and also online. We're really pleased to be able to bring this to you. And I'm really pleased to have two guests with whom I have both a personal connection and also through 1882. But most importantly, both Gracia and Huihan do very, very interesting work, and you'll find that out as we progress through the hour. I connected with Gracia Brown through her master's project, What About the Children? That's the short version of it, an oral history project that aims to highlight the lives of mixed race Asian Americans born before the legalization of interracial marriages in the United States. In addition to exploring notions of mixed Asian identity, Gracia will touch upon the important role oral histories play in the preservation of memory and history formation. She's originally from San Francisco. Gracia is a mixed Asian public historian and archivist currently based in New York City. And we'll get to her presentation in just a moment, but I'll go ahead and introduce Huihan Lee here next. Our other presenter is Huihan Lee, and his connection to me is both through 1882 and familial ties through marriage going back a couple of generations. That's the simple version of it. Huihan was born and raised in the Netherlands. His parents were from Indonesia, and 6 generations ago, his ancestors, like mine, emigrated from Fujian in southern China. He's the founder and CEO of My China Roots, which empowers people with Chinese heritage to trace their ancestors and connect with their relatives. My China Roots online family trees and database attract about 90,000 visitors each month and contain some 200 million searchable ancestors whose names and stories can be found in digitized clan books, U.S. immigration records, tombstones, and other historical documents based in Guangzhou. My China Roots also has a team of private family history detectives based in Guangzhou, providing custom research and travel services, traveling to customers' ancestral villages, conducting interviews, and digging up whatever family history traces might still be left. And I still need to take advantage of all that myself. So it's an interesting kind of connection. But first I'll turn it over here to Gracia and give her a chance to tell you about her work and how I kind of fit into that too.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your weekend to join us today. As Tingy mentioned, my name is Gracia Brown, and I'm here to talk about my oral history project, What About the Children? Oral history is about growing up mixed Asian before Loving versus Virginia. So last year I graduated from the Public History and Archives MA program from NYU, and this was my capstone. Next slide, please. So the genesis of this project really stems from my own experiences and identity as a mixed race Asian American. I was born in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1996 to a Chinese American mother and a white father. When my parents first started dating, my paternal grandmother's initial reaction was to ask my father, "But what about your children?" Her question reflected a popular concern that mixed race children were going to live difficult lives ostracized by either side. And I'll get into this some more in the next slide, but the idea of racial mixing has been considered so terrible and offensive that the prevention of mixed race children was often used in arguments to support the establishment of anti-miscegenation laws across the United States. So being born almost 30 years after the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case, I often wondered what my life would have been like to grow up in a time where my parents' marriage would have been deemed illegal. This project seeks to rephrase the question that my grandmother posed so many years ago and answer, well, what about the children? What were their lives like? Next slide, please. So one of my narrator requirements was that everyone had to be born before 1967, which was the year that the Supreme Court legalized interracial marriages across the United States in the Loving versus Virginia case. And before we dig deeper into the project, I just want to provide some historical background on Loving and anti-miscegenation laws in the country. So at various points in time, 41 states had passed anti-miscegenation laws which barred interracial marriages. 15 of them had laws specifically prohibiting white and Asian marriages. Maryland was the only state to ban Black and Asian. And it's important to note that even though state may not have specifically added Asians to their anti-miscegenation laws, it does not necessarily mean that Asian white marriages would have been culturally accepted in that region. Next slide, please. So in 1958, Richard and Mildred Loving, a Black and white interracial couple, were arrested and sentenced to a year in prison for violating Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which made it a felony for a white person to marry a non-white person. They appealed, claiming that the Racial Integrity Act violated the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment, and their case eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court. And as I mentioned earlier, mixed-race children were actually used in arguments to defend and support the existence of anti-miscegenation laws. So in the Loving case, Robert McIlwain, the lawyer for the state of Virginia, quoted Dr. Albert I. Gordon in his oral arguments, saying that interracial marriages causes a child to have almost insuperable difficulties in identification, and that the problems which a child of an interracial marriage faces are those which no child can come through without damage to himself. It is not infrequent that the children of intermarried parents are referred to not merely as the children of intermarried parents, but as the victims of intermarried parents and as the martyrs of intermarried parents. They were ironically arguing that in order to protect us, they needed to pass laws to prevent us. But really what they were so concerned about was the fact that mixed people challenged the status quo and proved that racial categories were not fixed nor static. And while not all of my narrators were from states with active anti-miscegenation laws, it is important to note that this was still the cultural and political climate in the country at the time that they were growing up. Next slide, please. So who were the narrators? I interviewed 10 people via Zoom who happened to represent all 4 regions of the continental US. There were 6 women and 4 men. The oldest was born in 1948, and the youngest was in 66. Next slide, please. So in addition to being born prior to 67, all narrators needed to have 1 Asian parent and 1 non-Asian parent. A lot of the mixed race studies literature and studies in the US tends to focus on half white people, usually Black and white mixed people. So instead of whiteness being the common denominator between my narrators, I thought this was an interesting opportunity to focus on how mixed Asians experience and exhibit Asianness. In terms of ethnic and racial backgrounds, the narrators were Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. For the non-Asian parents, 60% of the narrators had a white parent and 40% had a Black parent. I conducted pre-interview calls with all my narrators to explain the project in detail and get to know them better. Everyone received a list of potential questions in advance, which provided narrators with an opportunity to veto anything that they did not feel comfortable discussing. But I pretty much asked everyone similar questions so we could see the similarities and differences between the interviews. I wanted to know about how their parents met, what their childhoods were like, whether their self-identification had changed over time, or even if their self-identification differed from their siblings. Next slide, please. While I know, of course, that no community is a monolith, I was still really surprised by the diversity of the narrator stories. There were not a lot of discernible patterns that I could pull out. However, one of the similarities that I noticed was that a majority of my narrators' parents experienced estrangement or disapproval from their parents due to their interracial relationships. Parents were not happy with their children marrying outside of their race, but this was usually resolved with the birth of the mixed grandchildren. For example, I had a narrator, Nalani, whose Chinese-American mother got disowned by her father for marrying a Black man. Eventually, Nalani's grandfather did come around, and he helped Nalani's parents buy their first home. Next slide, please. In terms of societal acceptance, the Black Asian narrators definitely experienced more racism, and a majority of the hate and discrimination they faced was because they were Black, not because they were Asian or mixed. David was the only Black Asian man to volunteer for this project, and this was advice his Black father shared with him growing up. You gotta be careful. Be careful how you talk, how you present yourself, and be respectful at all times. On multiple occasions, David was forced to break up with his white girlfriends because the girl's parents did not want their daughter to date a Black man. And he was experiencing this from the 1970s through the early 90s, proving that prejudices against interracial relationships didn't just evaporate with the passing of Loving. At the same time, being half white did not save the white Asian narrators from also being called racial slurs or experiencing microaggressions. Several of the white Asian interviewees discussed people being surprised that they spoke English so well. Diana is a Chinese white dentist who had her own practice in Kansas, and people would often call her office asking the receptionist if she spoke English and if they would be able to understand her. Next slide, please. Many of the narrators did not know other mixed Asians growing up and struggled to find their place in Asian American spaces. For Tomio, he often felt his presence in Japanese American or Asian American organizations was often questioned because he didn't look Asian, and that led to him not being as involved in the community. Cindy felt similarly in that people would think that that was nice or cute or interesting, that you were interested in being Japanese American, but your place was not secure. Despite not being recognized as Asian by other Asian Americans, the majority of the narrators still claimed their Asian heritage and identified as mixed Asian. Next slide, please. One of the benefits of having an older group of narrators is that there's more lived experience to analyze. I could ask the narrators to reflect upon the ways that their identity may or may not have changed over the decades. And for the most part, people's self-identification didn't change a lot. However, I noticed that their feelings towards their identity changed, and that they often felt more positive about their mixed identity with time, that being mixed had become a source of pride. For Lisa, I always felt like I wasn't enough of either one, not recognizing the power in being the thing that I am. For Carol, being Japanese and Black in Kansas was really difficult and had elicited racist and painful experiences, to the point where she had used to wish that she wasn't mixed Asian, but now it's something that she's so thankful for. I do want to acknowledge that response bias definitely could have played a role in the responses I received, right? The assumption being that the people who chose to participate in my project are people already open and interested in sharing about their mixed race identity, and that it's possible that people who were ashamed or had negative feelings about their mixed identity would likely not have volunteered to participate. Although it would have been interesting to hear how their stories may have differed from my current interviewees. Next slide, please. Hoping to connect the narrators with future listeners and readers, I concluded every interview by asking narrators the same question. Do you have any words of wisdom for future generations of mixed Asians? Or is there any advice that you wish that someone had shared with you? And these were some of their responses. Tomio shared, don't let other people define who you are. And if you want to be a part of the community, you belong here as much as anybody. If you're willing to embrace your ethnic and cultural identity, don't let other people take that away from you. Carol wanted other mixed Asians to know that they're beautiful and that they should see the beauty 2 times over because they have the mix. That is that much more for them to celebrate and not to shun away from or be embarrassed about or to wish otherwise, but to soak it in, take it in, love all of it, and explore both sides. Next slide, please. So sometime this year, this project will be transferred to NYU's archives, where NYU will preserve and provide access to the oral history recordings, transcripts, and photographs. The archives are open to the public, so anyone, whether they're a researcher or not, can access the collection. When brainstorming for my capstone project, I knew that it was really important for me to contribute to the archives and historical record. The production of historical narratives relies heavily on primary sources, right? You can't write a history book or conduct genealogical research without historical records. For instance, a lot of the work that My China Roots does, that we'll learn more about, does depend on the creation and preservation of archival documents. So if we lack diverse archival material, then it hampers our ability to share diverse histories. And this is something that archives are already trying to address. There are many institutions that are changing their collecting policies to be more diverse, but that unfortunately doesn't change the fact that preserving Asian American records and stories has historically not been a priority. And if Asian American history has been overlooked, then the amount of historical resources we have on mixed Asians is even more scarce, right? So in doing research for this project, I could not locate any oral history projects in a publicly accessible archive that focus solely on mixed Asians. And this quote from Hamilton always moves me and motivates a lot of the work that I do, which is, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? Who was remembered and how are they remembered by?" One of the reasons that I was so drawn to oral history as a methodology and chose it for my capstone is that it allows everyday people to tell their stories in their own voices. I don't want us to be remembered by the words of men like Robert McElwain, who promoted misconceptions of what our tragic lives would be. Instead, I want us to tell our own stories and be remembered for how our lives actually were, complex and rich as anyone else's. I would like to thank each and every one of my narrators for sharing their stories with me. Growing up, I did not know any older mixed Asians to whom I could turn to for support or guidance on how to navigate growing up in this country mixed Asian. Seeing the parallels and similarities in our lives despite the age differences has made me feel less alone. My hope is that this project will not only fill in some gaps in the historical record for those interested in mixed race Asian American history, but that it can also be utilized as a resource for other mixed Asians looking to find community. That even in 100 years when we're all long gone, future generations can listen to these recordings and still be able to find pieces of themselves in these stories. Thank you. And thank you, Tingy, in 1882 for inviting me and letting me share a little bit more about my project.
Thank you so much, Gracia. And one thing I would like to just kind of touch upon here is clearly this is a very moving moment for you yourself. And one of the questions I had of you here really in looking at all the material you have is, were there particular comments and particular stories that really resonated with you, you know, aside from the ones that were also on the quotes, and maybe some of those, but what sort of personal reaction do you have to some of those kinds of things?
Yeah, it was really cool to see. I don't know, I feel like maybe that I don't know if it's a good thing, but that not much has changed over time, that there were still a lot of similarities culturally. Just to see how people grew up, what holidays did they celebrate, what foods did they eat at home, did they have rice at Thanksgiving and Christmas, you know? Most people had Asian names, either as a first name or a middle name, right? Despite the fact that pretty much none of them spoke the Asian language of their family, right? But that it was a way for their parents to sort of keep the cultural ties. I thought that was really interesting and cool. But it was just nice, you know, to talk to other mixed people and hear about them talk about their papas and gongongs, you know, like using the language that I grew up using as well.
Were the narrators aware really of, say, Loving versus Virginia and the history of miscegenation laws and how that might have affected their own upbringing?
That's a great question. I don't think that they were really conscious of it growing up. There was something I was really interested in, unfortunately, or it just the way that it was, that most of the narrators' parents were not married in states with active anti-miscegenation laws. There was only one couple. It was a Chinese man and white woman in Tennessee in the early 1950s. And when they went to go get married, the father went to put colored on the marriage certificate, and the clerk was like, "Don't do that. I won't be able to marry you. You need to put white." So that's what he did. Like, he was still able to get married, but it was sort of these like weird dynamics and rules, right? And the parents didn't really talk to their kids about race. You know, that was an interesting thing. It wasn't a topic of conversation at home. It wasn't something that people talked about even with their siblings, despite the experiences that they were going through in the public. So it's hard to say, right, for sure, if loving had any impact on the parents. It doesn't seem, for the most part, it did, because they weren't getting married in those states. But yeah, something I was interested in. It just didn't come up fully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and I'll come back to you with some other questions here, but I think I want to transition over to my China roots and Huihan, and ask you to first just kind of respond to the kind of things you've heard Gracia talk about, and also in your own experience, what kind of connections your organization and you personally have had with the kinds of experiences that we're dealing with.
Yes, thanks, Gracia, for your talk, and also thanks to Denise and Ted, everybody, 1882 Foundation, for organizing this. There were so many things that really resonated with me on a personal level, from what Gracia was saying, on a personal level, as well as recognizing patterns and I guess viewpoints and experiences from the people that we've been helping over the past 12 years. I think, well, maybe just starting with on the personal front. So I, as Tini mentioned, my background is that I was born and raised in the Netherlands, in a very basically Dutch countryside. So in my whole elementary school, there were 2 other Chinese kids, but the whole, all the grades, not in my class. But so it was all my friends were just very nice, but Caucasian boys and girls. So my ancestors came from China, but then 6 generations ago, they moved to Indonesia. So me growing up, I actually always grew up knowing that we were Asian, but the actual separation between Indonesia, or the difference between Indonesia and China, actually that realization came quite late for me, early, 10, 11, 12, where I really started even realizing that China is not the same as Indonesia. And because for me, it was just basically everything is different. So everything was normal for me as an experience in terms of what I knew at home, which was in Holland. And then every summer we would go to Indonesia, and we would, of course, have our customs and patterns there, and we would meet all the same people every year, and we would eat the same dishes every year. So that became more normal too. But I never really figured some of the things that we ate were more Indonesian, some of the things were peranakan, and some of the things were Chinese. I didn't even actually, that was really interesting. I remember thinking at some point, so do Chinese people actually look different from Indonesian people? And it took me a while, really, to distinguish them, just purely physically distinguish people, with different, I guess, Asian backgrounds. So yeah, this is just, it's not really, I don't really have a point here. I'm just sharing. And I think I just recognize a lot of what Gracia said too. And fast forward to today, I have 2 kids, 8 and 10, and my wife is Irish, Caucasian Irish. So they are mixed themselves. So they, basically, if you add their backgrounds up, you end up with Dutch, Indonesian, Chinese, and then Irish, British, and Swiss. So talking about mixes, I mean, yeah, and we've lived in China for, well, the kids since they were born, and we actually recently moved to Europe, which is where I'm calling in from now. So and the kids, just talking about the kids, they've been going to bilingual schools. So, but in China, me and my wife thought it was good and important for the kids to be not in an international bubble, but to have, some roots, I guess, or develop some roots, and having exposure to a Chinese, at least in linguistically, because at home we speak Dutch and English, so linguistically that they have that they're native level speaking Chinese speakers, but also to have basically 2 legs, one in each, so one leg in the Chinese education system, but also for there to be English language education. So with bilingual schools, and the same is actually applicable now. That we're looking at schools that have one leg into the local education system, in this case French, and then it's actually current discussion on whether the other half is going to be more English or / American, British, or Chinese education, or maybe Dutch education. So we're quite in the middle of all those considerations and decisions on what about our kids. I actually in the quite regularly, but just 2 days ago, in the run up to the event here today, I was chatting with the kids about it, about how they felt, and I was asking them how they felt being mixed, and it was interesting, and this, I think, then also goes to the point of that every single individual is different, and we all have our own experiences and characters and quirks, I guess, and that's on the one hand what makes it fascinating, but it's there are also patterns that are recognizable. And with respect to the oldest, he's 10. He was very clear and blunt in saying, I like it, and to me, it's basically a real cool thing that I speak 3-4 languages. And I asked him, does it not bother you that I asked him whether he felt that he belonged to any of those groups that we basically the language groups, and then lacking thereof, whether that bothered him. And he said, he was very clear. He says, no, I think it's just basically enriching rather than a lacking. And then the 8-year-old girl, she was a lot more she was saying, that she feels sometimes she doesn't fit in, and especially in the last month since we've moved to Europe. And she used the word belonging. I don't feel like I belong in certain groups at school. And what I found then interesting is that I started asking, okay, so what groups in your mind are there, or what girls, what friends, and what groups do they then belong to? And then as we sort of started dissecting it, she then also started thinking, oh yeah, maybe it is the case that all the other friends that she has, they all have different backgrounds too. And we sort of settled on this finding that what she perceived as a group wasn't actually made up of individuals that were all really like-minded and uniform, and the concept of a group was also very much one in her mind that she perceived to be that way, and she perceived her to be outside that group. So yeah, I think it's also very much a matter of perception, and then basically to talk about it and to exchange experiences, and to then have people who in the beginning feel like they are very much in or on the outside of things, think through, well, is the other group really that homogenous, or is there really a group? There was, I took a few notes. Actually, I had a.
I just wanted to ask you too, in your own experience and that of people who come to My China Roots for information, are a lot of them of mixed race backgrounds?
Yeah. Well, I would say, well, a bit less than half. So I don't know if you would call that much or not much. And let's say in the last 12 years, we've done around 1,000 families, so custom research and travel projects, so a bit less than half. And what we see now that we have a second pillar to the work we do, which is an online platform, where people can just fill in the names of their ancestors, and basically they will then get a list of historical records that contain those stories. It's likely similar, because we got a lot of requests from people also for the online portion of things that make it clear that they are mixed backgrounds. And I think one thing that I have noticed and that I find really interesting is the link between, on the one hand, how a person sees different cultures, or how a person feels about the relationship between themselves and a culture, and how often that is linked to the relationship that they had with the relevant parent. So the link between a personal relationship and that what you then as a child associate the culture, that culture with, the culture you associate that parent with. And that is, yeah, that's a recurring pattern, I would say. And I think, yeah, Gracia, you referred to parents, you mentioned parents very often not wanting to talk about past or issues of race or culture. That is very much a recurring pattern. And that has basically led to a lot of the people who come to us for help, that because their parent or their grandparent never wanted to talk and they had questions, but those were left unanswered. That for that reason, that people come to us and say, well, we want to find out where we're from, and very often it's not even that clear of a goal that people have that they come to us for. Very often, actually, the goals might change a bit from what carries their key interest and what drives them to have us do the research together with them. But very often, it does end up with a feeling of, I guess, well, maybe gratitude for seeing a person more clearly, and the person, primarily a parent or a grandparent, and understanding why that parent or grandparent behaved the way that he or she did, understanding the often traumatic experiences, or very, I mean, you talk about migration. I mean, it's one does not just pack up and leave to a country like 1,000 miles where you don't speak the language. Just you don't. One does not take that decision lightly. So, and there were typically reasons that were just not very nice. Obviously, political unrest, economic considerations. So that obviously very often went hand in hand with a traumatic experience, and getting a firmer grip, just understanding it, and then I guess developing some empathy from the people that we then help. Yeah, that really frees them up. It gives them insight that they didn't have, and it just gives them very often a lot more of a peace of mind about their childhood and about themselves. And that is, I guess, also one of the key reasons why we love doing what we do, and why we think it's valuable to do what we do.
There's one comment you made from your daughter saying she sometimes didn't feel like she belonged. And I'd like to get your reaction to that when you're living in different societies and different cultures. You know, what does it really mean to belong? You're in France now, right? So how does that work with her trying to belong there, having had the experience before? And then, Rossi, I'd like you to kind of respond to that whole notion of belonging. And, you know, a question that often comes up in the States here too is assimilation. What does that really mean in trying to become part of something bigger? And I think the downside of that assimilation term is sometimes it's seen as better.
Oh, this is such a big topic. I mean, if you ask me personally, and let me put it this way, those, I guess, projects and people that I feel, I guess, most fulfilled about are those that come out and say, I don't feel a need to either define myself using definitions that were decided by somebody else. I don't feel, it's not so much that they say that I don't feel a need to belong, because everybody does, but it's maybe that there is more of a peace of mind, just being at ease with oneself, that question of, oh, I need to search for something or a place where I belong is less on the foreground. And I think I also, just speaking for myself, one of the key reasons why I started my China roots was because when I started digging into our own family history, one of the consequences was that I just felt less in need of needing to define myself using other people's definitions. If people are interested, I'm very happy to share my whole story and with all its complexities and different geographical locations in the world. And if somebody, on the other hand, if somebody just tells me, hey, you're whatever it is, you're Chinese or Dutch, then I think that's their problem. If they, I don't feel a need to, I guess I don't take it personally, and I don't feel a need to either defend myself or, use definitions that other people have come up with for political reasons. So yeah, for me, that is important. That's also what I try to transfer to my kids. And it is a pattern that I often see with people that we help, that it's not so much at the end somebody saying, oh, I feel American now, or I feel more Chinese, or I feel more Indonesian. It's I feel more me. And in all my complexities and all my ancestors' grayness. And that is that's what I love it for, that just people feel more comfortable with themselves.
Thank you. That's very affirming there. Gracia, your take on that?
Yeah, the responses really varied in terms of belonging, right? You had people who felt like they did belong. They didn't feel ostracized. They felt like it really didn't impact their lives that much. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you had people who did feel a lot of rejection. I had a woman say that she felt like she was a pariah. She never got married. She didn't really date because she didn't feel like other people could really truly understand her and her mixed identity and being sort of like in between. But like I mentioned before, like despite rejection, acceptance, all of it, like people still knew who they were, right? They always reaffirmed that they were mixed, that they were both. There was never any doubts for themselves, right, of who they were. Something that was interesting though was Hawaii came up several times. It came up in yours, and it was something I've experienced as well, where people recounted going to Hawaii for the first time and feeling for the first time that they belonged, right? That they weren't different, they fit in, people looked like them, and that being a really huge moment for them that decades later, right, that they're bringing it up in these interviews. For one woman, she's like, she felt pretty for the first time, beautiful being in Hawaii. And that was really interesting. And I also remember going to Hawaii once as a child and none of that registered for me. But when I went as an adult, I felt similarly of just like, wow, it felt really, really nice to see so many faces that looked like you. So that was something that came up.
Especially you say that because, part of my background was as a Peace Corps volunteer, and we trained before I went to Korea as a volunteer in Hawaii. And I had very much that same kind of feeling being among that population as well. So it's really kind of an interesting dynamic that I think takes place, and the role of geography in this whole migration aspect of it too. And just maybe one more thought about that to you, Wei-Han. Yeah.
Well, just to affirm, basically, because I I went to China 20 years ago, and I had just graduated. And up until the first day in China, I never realized how powerful it is to have everybody around you look like you. And up until that time, I was always on the, I guess, thinking about concepts like nationalism and patriotism, and I always thought, oh, that's just well, not bad, but I mean, it's I never really could actually get it. I never really understood how that worked for a lot of people, because I never had very strong feelings of nationalism or patriotism in any direction, so I just didn't really get it. That's a better way of saying it. But then when I got to China, and I remember being in the subway, and it was probably 9 a.m. or so, like rush hour, and it was just a sea of black-haired heads, and it's just, and it was really interesting to then realize, first of all, how, I guess, primal need, or at least how much superficial security it gives when everybody looks like you and everybody in the first millionth of a second embraces you as one of them, or just accepts you. For me, it was interesting, doubly interesting, because I didn't speak a word of Chinese when I first arrived in China. So there was that. On the one hand, I noticed that everybody accepted me as them. On the other hand, I felt very far removed from them because I couldn't communicate with them, and I just knew that my worldview was just very different from theirs. But then I also realized, well, this is exactly the mirror, the opposite of my experience in Holland, where I always felt the same as my peers who tended to be Caucasian, because we had the same cultural references and we grew up watching the same, I guess, TV shows. But on the other hand, whenever I would come into a shop in Amsterdam, people would just, in the first tenth of a second, regard me as somebody from outside because I look different. And it was just really interesting to see that switch and to see, those opposing images. And I wouldn't say, and then the question is one of belonging. I wouldn't say I felt I'm at home or I belong in China, but I did feel for the first time, wow, this is it's quite intense and it goes quite deep. Just the very superficial concept of just looking the same as people around you.
Thank you. Let's see, do we have any questions from people online?
We do. Let's scroll up to the top. We have one question from Amy, which asks, I think it's to Gracia, but what do you hope for the future of this project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope to continue it. This is sort of like my own personal passion. This project I've wanted to do for a really long time. And thankfully the archives allows me to continue to donate to it for essentially perpetuity. So I plan on doing more interviews and adding to it. Something that I noticed holes in my own project, was that I didn't have any South or Southeast Asians. And obviously working in the time frame that I am of pre-1967, we're limited in terms of Asian migration that was happening before then. But there was substantial populations of both Filipinos and Indian and Bengali men that went to New York and married Puerto Rican and Black women. So those are holes that I'm definitely looking to fill, is to get more South and Southeast representation, to get mixes of Asian Latinos, I don't have any of those. And so really just trying to diversify the project to be as inclusive as I can. Yeah.
Sounds ambitious.
I know.
A long way to go. Another question there, Mia?
Yeah, we have another question from May, who asked, what percentage of parents that originally did not approve of the mixed relationship came around to accept and support it?
Yeah, thankfully, all of them. I would say 70% of the narrators, their parents experienced disapproval from their parents, but they all did eventually come around, some sooner than others. And often these were stories, that the narrators didn't know existed for a while, Not even for some of them until they grew up and other people in the family told them. It wasn't even their parents to tell them that they experienced estrangement or were even disowned. So that was really interesting that it came out. But yeah, everyone, once the kids, the grandkids, everyone wanted to be involved with their grandchildren's lives, so.
And I can kind of speak to that in my own case, which I think, Gracia knows about. But in the case of my mother's father, he did not attend the wedding of my father and my mother. It was just right after World War II, and he would not accept the marriage. But I think it was really the introduction of my older brother into the family that probably turned their corner, because he did. And he came to the States and visited, with us afterwards. So it turned the corner. Wan, do you have any comment or experience there with this kind of thing, of the rejection of, say, parents to the wedding or to the marriage or relationship that was going on with their children?
Yes, I mean, definitely from customers So, so many. Okay, so the first one that came to mind, well, it wasn't so much parents, but society. And then, okay, so this was a great grandmother of a customer of ours, and the great grandmother was American Caucasian, and she, as a missionary, went to southern China, and she married a Chinese, or she got into a relationship with a Chinese man, and they were together, and that was the reason for her being dismissed by the Guangdong, the Canton mission. So then they went to Hong Kong. Well, actually, first they tried to get married. They couldn't do so, but then they went to Hong Kong to try to get married there. They were refused 3 times by local authorities to get married, and then in the end they did get married in Hong Kong, and then they moved to Hong Kong, and then essentially because society didn't accept them there, they then moved to the US. And basically, there the whole story continued where they weren't accepted, and they had to change their, or they chose to, they changed their last name from Lam, Lam, like Lin Lam, to Lam with a B, so that it would sound or look, appear American English. So these stories of mixed couples not being accepted by the families as well as his wider society, that sadly many of them. Yeah, I actually have a question, because the word estrangement to Gracia, because I found that interesting. Is it estrangement in the sense that these people, they felt more closely connected before, but with their parents, but then they became estranged, or have they always have they never really had a connection for different reasons in the first place?
Yeah, the former, right? I think that there was still communication, right? And that after these marriages, that either die down or stops completely, right? But maybe not necessarily to the point where they were disowned. There was just tensions and people not willing to talk to each other and accept one another. Yeah.
And I'm wondering too whether that may have, spread out to beyond just the immediate relationship, but whether, with siblings that you might have had who married, say, within their race, if they felt any kind of antagonism, with other relatives that way.
Yeah, I asked about their relationships with the extended families, and for the most part, it was fine. Mm-hmm. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even if most people's cousins weren't mixed, right? They were the only mixed ones in the families, but they felt like their family treated them just the same and loved them just the same. So that was good. Yeah.
We'll have to wrap up soon, but do we have a couple more anyway, at least?
Yeah, we have a couple comments from Gordon and Daryl just sharing some different experiences of either personal experiences of people they know, people who have either their family did not accept them for having mixed relations, and then others who they finally came around. And then we have a question from Liz who said, someone stayed before parents do not have to talk about racism with their kids. Why is that?
Yeah. I asked one of my narrators that, why she thought her parents didn't talk about it, give them any advice, right, on how to navigate the racism that they were experiencing in school. And her theory was that they were in the process of dealing with it themselves, right? They were going through it, and that they didn't have much to say because they were still trying to figure out for themselves how to process the racism that they were experiencing, both individually and as a couple. I don't know if you have any thoughts on why your parents may or may not have.
I think maybe a little bit contrary to what you were finding from the others. My parents were more open, I think, about just the nature of where we fit in terms of race. And I think I told you in one of the interviews about my brother. What was kind of interesting is, in my own case, my brother and I both have our Chinese names, Ting Pao and Ting Yi, but my sisters are Monique and Elizabeth, kind of French names. And, why was that? But at a certain point, I think my mother sensed that we were having, maybe some difficulties in school, at least my older brother. And would you prefer to have, another name? And in my brother's case, he's Ting Pao, P-A-U. The kind of natural extension of that would be Paul. Why don't you be Paul? And she asked, what would you like asking of me? And I didn't know what to say. I said, Humphrey. This is the first time I ever publicly gave that name there. But and I don't know whether it was because of Humphrey Bogart or what at the time. But that was what I thought. But obviously neither stuck because I've gone through my whole life here as Tingy. But that's kind of the interesting thing of dealing with it. And also we were part of a Jewish community that we were living and growing up with. And I think because of their experiences pretty soon after World War II and growing up in that environment, that had something to do with why we were maybe more open about talking about those kinds of backgrounds for a group that obviously had, gone through the Holocaust. And our neighbor across the way was a survivor of a concentration camp, and she had the tattoo on her arm. So we had that, kind of thing that was part of our particular niche that we were growing up in.
To add to that, sorry, several of my narrators, their parents were incarcerated during World War II. They were Japanese American. And so that was interesting too, because, right, that was something that they didn't really want to talk about. Like speaking about racism, right? So they had to come to terms with their own incarceration. And then once they were much older, right? And then that's when they started having conversations with their kids. So traumatic experiences like that, I think obviously do impact the conversations within the family. Yeah.
I kind of have a question that builds off of that. Kind of like also because this is also my experience, and I was wondering if like you or like any of the people that you talked to had, or like could touch on kind of the experience of like if they, and I know you had like participants who were like one parent was white or one parent was black, but I have a Japanese mom and then a white American dad. And kind of something that I realized that I had to navigate through is like being intimately perceived by whiteness growing up. So I was wondering like because like I think it's also a different experience when the mother is the Asian parent versus the father is the Asian, and like vice versa. Because my mother curated a lot of like my cultural like identity and kind of like what he was like talking about on the screen, like your relationship with your parent impacts your relationship with your culture. And it kind of touches on this like conversation of talking about racism too, because my mom was fully Japanese and she didn't have an Asian American identity or consciousness, and my dad was like just an American man. And so I feel like a lot of how my dad, my white father, interacted and like responded to whether it was like fostering or embracing my mom and like the family like Japanese cultural had like a big impact on how I perceive myself through whiteness. And I was like wondering alternatively how that was like different versus if it was like an Asian parent and then the other was a black parent. That was a long-winded question.
That's a lot. I also went into this project curious, right, if having an Asian mom or an Asian dad impacted experiences or identity. And it was all over the place. I was like wrong. Like when I'm maybe wondering, right, if you had an Asian mom that you would grow up with more Asian culture, but that wasn't necessarily the case. I think food-wise, yes. I think the food that they grew up with at home tended to be more influenced by their Asian culture if they had an Asian mom. But in terms of identity or how they perceive themselves, like I had one woman, she had a white mom and a Japanese dad, and her identity was huge part of her life that she ended up career-wise going into mixed race stuff, right? And being part of the Japanese American redress movement and everything, and just so involved in the community. So I can't say, right, like I couldn't say that if you had a white mom, you were less likely to partake in the community or not. I think you asked like how they experience whiteness as well. I think that was a mix. I think those that were white and Asian obviously benefited from having light skin, right? But still, especially other kids were perceiving them to be Asian, right? Like they were still getting called Asian slurs at school. And interestingly enough, it was never the group that they were, right? If they were Japanese, they were going to get called Chinese slurs. If they were Korean, they were going to get called Chinese slurs. Like, and if they're Chinese, they were getting called Japanese slurs. Like, you know, it was like this crazy messed up racism. But it also, part of me wondered if like the white kids did know what Asian they were, and they were purposefully not calling them whatever. But yes, that was something I was curious about, and I don't know if I can say that there were exactly patterns to pull out from them, because people from all sides were having different experiences. I would also need a larger, I think, sample size before I can say anything definitively.
Yeah, I kind of ignored the group here. If there were any other questions from here, I was concerned about making sure we got it online, but any other questions here? Okay, Mia, is there anything else that we need to cover there?
A lot of questions in the chat.
Okay, I think we kind of addressed where Gracia was going maybe next in her things. What do you see as the future for My China Roots in areas that maybe you haven't explored yet?
Oh, so we are all about what Gracia mentioned too, basically the value of, I guess, digging up stories and archives and making it possible for people to just learn more about their own family histories. So for the next 2-3 years, we will definitely still be focusing on the Chinese diaspora, because there's still so much to do there. And I think as Gracia also mentioned, that there's just a lot of there's so many records that are essentially gathering dust and have so many valuable stories, records of clan associations, business directories, just any graves, tombstones. And what we are really focusing on today is to digitize all those records and then to connect the data points so that the fuller stories will emerge. Now, the coming 2-3 years, as I mentioned, it's still very much focusing on the Chinese diaspora, but the aim is definitely to exceed the Chineseness of the records and other Asian diasporas. Definitely, we actually get a lot of, well, Japanese, Korean definitely, but also Indian requests. And that's a whole different animal. Wrong word, but still, because there are different ways of keeping the records. But in terms of my personal interest and dream, I would really love to East Asia and South Asia and other countries too, just to archive all the documents, documental footprints, to scan them and to make them available to people who are curious.
Well, thank you. And one of the things that we want to do with 1882 is work with you, of course, to see if about a workshop that we have planned sometime in the future with doing that here in the States as well. So we'll coordinate with getting that program together. But really appreciate you explaining what it is you're doing. And Gracia, many thanks to you for being here. Yes, let's give a round of applause to the participants here.